Good morning and welcome to Global Perspectives. From our studio in Orlando, I'm David Dumke. We are honored today to be joined from Australia by Senator David Van. Senator Van represents Victoria in the Australian Senate, and it's a pleasure to have you on, Senator. Welcome.
David, thank you so much for having me on. It's great to join your show. Wonderful to see you again. So I'm very much looking forward to this discussion.
Excellent. Well, there's a lot of things I want to ask you, but let's start with, isn't necessarily an easy question, but tell us a little about the state of U.S.-Australian relations. I know there's been a lot of talk in the last couple of years about the U.S.-UK-Australian Defense Pact, and I know you serve on the Foreign Affairs Committee as well as Defense and Trade Committees are among your assignments.
Yes, so I'm on the Joint Standing Committee of Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade. I'm Deputy Chair of the Foreign Affairs and Aid Subcommittee, and I'm on the Defence Subcommittee. So this falls well within my wheelhouse, and it's an area that certainly in the 3.5 years I've been in the Senate that I've been working on very hard, as a real priority. I think we saw certainly for your audience. I'm in our centre-right party. We lost government last May. Now we have a centre-left party in government. So certainly I can say in the lead up to last year's election, we saw a lifting in Australia-US relations like I don't think we've ever seen before. So certainly not in my lifetime. And so that obviously culminated in the AUKUS Pact, where Australia, the US and the UK came to an agreement to assist Australia not only acquire nuclear submarine technology, but a range of other incredibly important technologies from all sides. And this is a three-way street. It's not even just a two-way street. So I think, I don't think under this current government that relations have gone backwards. I do worry about the future, certainly with their appointment of a former Prime Minister as our ambassador to the US. But let's see how that pans out. But I think without doubt, we're seeing certainly a zenith, and that hopefully that trajectory keeps on going. But the feeling of Australians towards the US, it couldn't be stronger.
On this defense pact in particular, obviously there's a lot of talk about the Chinese threat in Asia. I'd like to hear what Australia sees in China. Obviously, it's a major trade partner of yours. It's also a neighbor in much closer proximity than to Washington.
Yes, the geography is true, but I think the threat is much broader than just a geographical one. The threat, as we've seen in Ukraine with the Russian invasion, threats to even one country is a threat to all of us around the world. Certainly all liberal-minded democracies around the world have every reason to be cautious and be careful and to be prepared. And I think that's where AUKUS has taken us. I recently wrote a paper. I'm doing a second master's at the moment. That paper, is titled, "Is China already at war with Taiwan?" And it's one of those nebulous questions that academics will debate with me through and through, and I'm sure my fellow politicians will debate with me. But China, as we've seen over 70 years, has fought a war of incrementalism, whether it be the Paracels, the Spratlys, Senkakus, Taiwan. There is such a range of points that didn't become flashpoints, but could have just as easily. The trade war with Australia and with the US, other grey zone, grey zone tactics that we see, in the cyber domain and others, misinformation, disinformation. This is all going on real time. And under any other context, you could call them aggressive tactics. So, I think the world is right to watch China, to hold it to account, and to be prepared. And this Australian, US, and what the world is writing into all their defence strategy, white papers or strategy papers currently around integrated defence is the right way to go. We are much stronger together. And what I think Australia and the US do incredibly well is make good allies that are reliable and solid and will back each other every step.
You yourself have spoken out often on Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Obviously, there are issues there specific to Ukraine, but there's also, you were just talking about China, and you have Taiwan right there. Is there a fear of a similar situation if Russia's allowed to get away with going through Ukraine and occupying it, as you would see in China and Taiwan?
Yes, I wrote about this even before the invasion, that this is the threat that the world is facing, that if one authoritarian regime sees another authoritarian regime get away with this sort of aggression, I think it's the gloves are off and the fight's on. So luckily the world has got behind Ukraine. I cannot thank the US government and the US people for what it's done, because you stand out a million miles ahead of everyone else on what you've done. I was in Ukraine August last year. I believe I'm still the only Western MP that's been down into the area of operations. Obviously lots of Ukrainian, and as I was told at a multilateral forum last year by a number of Russian MPs, that they've been there. And this war is a very real, very harsh war on the people of Ukraine. And it's beholden to all of us to stand up and stand with Ukraine, provide as much material as possible. I fought long and hard, particularly trying to push the Germans into sending Leopard tanks in there. Obviously, the Brits have done their bit. Now the US has stepped up with the Abrams M1. That is now the right sort of material that we're sending in. What I was seeing through most of last year was countries were sending a lot of material, but not just the right kind. So HIMARS was obviously a game changer when you sent that in there. I think the M1s and the Leopards and the Challenger tanks, maybe France sent some Leclercs, but there's still more needed. The two platforms that I have been calling for long and hard and for most of the last year is main battle tanks, but then fighter jets. Without gaining some form of air superiority, or at least having credible air defence, both having air-to-air, and that includes against other fighter jets, but also cruise missiles. But then air-to-ground strike is also incredibly important in this battle. It's just the nature of this battle that it's the right platforms that are needed, not just more platforms.
You, as you were saying, you serve on the Foreign Relations Committee. Obviously, you're talking about Ukraine and Asian security issues. I'd like you to explain a little to our viewers about what some of Australia's foreign policy objectives are. In short, I know this is a very broad question, but it'd be helpful, I think.
Well, you won't be surprised that it's to keep a free and open and prosperous Indo-Pacific. We, like the US, adopted the Indo-Pacific as a region of interest. For us, it is our region. It's where we live. Our East Coast borders the Pacific. Our West Coast borders the Indian Ocean. So we naturally straddle both of those. And geography is a great teacher of strategy. And I always, whenever I talk about geostrategic matters or geopolitical, I always have a big map of the Indo-Pacific in front of me, and it tells you a lot. There is a land bridge that comes down, down the coast of Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, etc. Then you've got two very small bits of water. The Straits of Malacca at Malaysia, Singapore there, and the Straits of Johor, and they're going to become incredibly contested waters, and how Australia, the US, and our other allies work to do that will be incredibly important. Obviously, we have a vested interest in the Indo-Pacific, as does our allies and friends like South Korea and Japan. Overnight, we heard that the French were stepping up again. They were talking with our Defence Minister and Foreign Minister, and it sounds like they're prepared to do a bit more in the Pacific. Now, they have national interest already in the Western Pacific, but I think it's beholden on them to look at that broader region as well, not just defend their own national interests, but to defend the interests of liberal democracies.
Trade obviously is an important component of this. Could you explain some of your key trade partnerships in the Indo-Pacific region and globally?
Yes, certainly. Obviously, China is our largest trading partner by some way. Unlike most countries, we export more to them than they export to us. So, they've had us over a barrel over the past few years and have used trade or geo-economic coercion as one of those grey zone tactics that I've talked about. Again, overnight, and since the 20th Congress, I think we've seen some softening of that. And there was some news overnight that it looks like some of our coal ships might be heading back to China. But, there's still, they've got massive tariffs on our barley. They've stopped without even using tariff structures. They've stopped our wine exports. Believe it or not, lobster exports, that's a much loved commodity up there, as I think our wine has become over the last decade or two as well. So I think the Chinese consumer is looking forward to some of this. Obviously, the barley gets used in Chinese beer. I've heard anecdotally that no one's liked Chinese beer as much as when they were using Australian barley. So, I know they used some US barley to do that, so at least some of their beer must have been pretty good as well.
One of the export products of Australia, you're blessed with mineral resources, but one of your primary exports is coal. And I know you have an interest also in improving, in climate change is also one of your interests. How do you balance those two? Coal exporting, which is obviously can be quite a dirty fuel, and environmental protection.
Yeah, well, since we met in Sharm el-Sheikh for COP27, I've always been interested in this space. I have a background in the energy industry here in Australia. I think what we need to do as a nation first is clean up our own backyard. Our coal fleet's retiring very, very quickly. We had set a trajectory to be able to cover that off with renewables and deep storage. We're seeing a move away from that with this government. Yes, they're trying to add in more renewables, but they're trying to do it by adding in long-range transmission, which no one wants in their backyard. So I think there's going to be some real challenges for them to meet their 43% target. I'm doing a piece of work at the moment which is rewriting what we call our energy technology roadmap. Some of the things I learned in Sharm el-Sheikh are on there, but also there's some incredibly important and powerful technologies that have been developed here in Australia that I think are going to go a long way to solving not just our emissions problems and energy supply. And our electricity grid was built to transmit energy from a source to the cities and where that load is used. We now have a problem where some of the properties of introducing a lot of renewables that produce DC electricity and pumping it into an AC grid is going to cause both some supply and security issues for our national electricity market. So I've been doing a lot of work. How do you resolve for that? Now, the coal export part of it is, we export $80+ billion, nearly $90 billion worth of coal to the world. That coal is some of the cleanest in the world. So, if countries are going to keep on burning coal, our view is, okay, well, let's at least send them clean coal. We know that's going to phase out over time, as the world moves towards, net zero by 2050. That is going to have to, be phased out. But at the moment, those exports are paying for an awful lot of what is needed in our transition. Our Paris target's 43%. I think it can and should be higher, and I will be arguing that over this calendar year, and putting forward a credible plan on how to get there as well. But let's not deceive ourselves. The transition to net zero, and especially to our Paris targets, and by we I mean all of ours, is going to be long, hard, and very, very expensive. Our coal exports pay, for an awful lot of that transition. So, I think we would be cutting our nose off to spite our face and not, lowering our emissions if we were to stop exporting coal. But, we can also do things, and some of the things I've been working hard on is how do we, we're a huge iron ore exporter, $100 billion worth of iron ore each year. Things like that, rather than putting effectively rock on a ship and shipping it across to a smelter. I'm encouraging some of our iron ore companies to build smelters on the side of their mines, powering it with renewable electricity and turning it into green iron, and then shipping it to our friendly nations like Korea and Japan to turn into green steel, which we know with the European carbon barriers coming into force in 2025, no country is going to be able to meet their targets without green steel, plus green cement and green aluminium. And I think if we get our power mix right, we will be able to be a net exporter of those, which will eventually replace, coal, LNG, as I think further down the track, countries will stop using that, but we will also be able to replace that with a very credible and large hydrogen industry, which we're working incredibly hard at doing at the moment.
Of course, when you're in politics as you are, you represent people, and these are jobs, and some of the jobs are tied to industries that may not be the most environmentally friendly. So it's always a very difficult balance. But I want to look at the positive side of opportunities. What are some of the opportunities you see by having more of a green policy in Australia?
It's enormous. As I just said, I believe Australia can and will be, a net exporter of hydrogen, one of the largest in the world. But that won't happen just by adding more renewables. There are countries with nuclear energy that can run hydrolyzers 24/7. The economics of running hydrolyzers to produce hydrogen on a part-time basis, i.e. when there's excess solar or wind, don't quite stack up as well. So the energy technology roadmap I'm working on is, do we need to look at bringing nuclear into the system? And I'm only talking about the SMR end of nuclear in this debate. I think certainly here in Australia that the large-scale nuclear won't have a place and won't be accepted by the Australian people. And we have some legislative barriers to get over. We have a moratorium on nuclear energy here in Australia currently. But there's a lot of work that I think we can do before the next election to both convince our people and the world that we can do nuclear safely, that it's there are no proliferation issues, that it's going to help firm up our grid, so take away some of that supply security concerns that I currently have, because if you're only looking at batteries, you're talking about shallow storage. In some states, we're blessed with pumped hydro, which will also contribute to that mix, and I'm very bullish on pumped hydro in Australia. But again, some states are very dry, and pumped hydro won't be an issue. So states like South Australia and Western Australia, where they're dry, they're remote, and if your audience haven't been to some of these parts of Australia, they are very, very remote. Like you'd be blown away by how remote they are. I've been to some remote parts of the US, down in Nevada, etc., and they seem like a stone's throw from a major city compared to what it's like in Australia. So I can see some siting opportunities for SMRs attached to our mining industry that can help support the grid, being the first steps to introduce nuclear into the Australian energy mix in a very safe way from a siting point of view, isn't engaging with people. I don't want that in my backyard. So it's I think there's a great opportunity for us. And I think that will help bump up our Paris targets or whatever we go to in COP 2025, where everyone's going to be asked to bump up their 2035 targets. So I think that they're all important considerations on both how we structure our export mix and how we keep those jobs. And when we were in government, we did a lot of work around where coal is being mined or used as an energy source at the moment. How do we turn them into renewable energy hubs to keep the industry going in those areas, build out new industries, and then keep those jobs in Australia?
Australia's had a lot of problems with droughts, of course, in the past, as well as other natural disasters. Are you seeing these occur on a more frequent basis because of climate change?
It's a really interesting question. And, I think there is our Bureau of Meteorology is saying, yes, they are becoming more frequent. But Australia's always been a country of droughts, flooding, rains, bushfires or wildfires, as you would call them. There's a very famous poem written in 1924 from a poet, Dorothy McKellar, that talks about a land of droughts and flooding plains. This is not new, and even in the most recent floods, very few of the floods, hit the same sort of levels that we've seen, over the last century. Now, some did, but that's the nature of historic events. And of course, they are major and historic events, and the damage done has been terrible, but they're not new to Australia. So that's not to deny that climate change has played a part. It very well has, and most likely has, but they're not a new phenomenon here in Australia. Whereas in some countries, I think some countries are seeing these as new phenomena. They're just part of the Australian landscape.
When you're talking about climate and environmental protection issues per se, you're a member of the center-right party, and the center-left party is in power right now. What are are there big differences on environmental approach, or is there consensus that environment is an important issue to constituents? You may talk about it differently, but it's a critical part of your agenda.
It definitely is a critical part of it. And we achieved enormous emissions reductions while we were in government. And that bit's glossed over, a lot in the media. We actually achieved some enormous targets, and we were, well on track to get to 35-38% by 2030. And we were saying that last year that was doable then. So we've achieved a lot. We're hearing a lot of talk at the moment, not seeing a lot of movement. The plan that the current government has put forward, I don't think is credible. After a large part of my career in the energy industry and working on and for the electricity grid, I can see Australia suffering from security challenges by having a lack of energy security in coming years, decades. If our coal fleet retires faster than we're currently prepared for, Australia's in a world of hurt. And any government that can't keep the lights on, can't run the country. That's when our economy will really suffer and people's jobs will really suffer. So I'm very bullish on higher targets, but I also think we need a more credible path to get there. And those are using mature technologies like pumped hydro, like nuclear. These are the things that are going to help us get there. Looking at ways where we can site wind and solar near transmission rather than having to build new transmission, or siting the solar in ways that it's near where that energy is used. It's far more efficient. It's less capex. There's some great Australian technologies that are going to allow us to do exactly that. And I'm working hard with those companies and those universities at the moment to help develop those and get those moving. We've got some great medium to deep storage technologies coming through. So I think I'm seeing a way to get to more ambitious targets and to protect the planet and to slow global warming. And I think Australia has done and will do more than its fair share of that.
So we have time for just one more quick question. It's not really a quick one, but we'll have to make it quick. And that's on the environmental issues. How closely are Australia and the United States coordinating or cooperating?
That's a good question. Now being out of government, I'm not probably close enough to that to tell. Your IRA was, Inflation Reduction Act was, I think, a great clarion call. It's incentivizing American companies to do more, and that's your government's job as well. What I'm trying to work on with some of my colleagues and friends in the US and in other countries is, okay, how do we not have such a siloed effect? How do we look at where is the best bang for buck? Does some of these Australian technologies have been talking about, could they play a role in helping the US reduce its emissions? There's a lot of work to be done. I'm hoping to be over there again in coming months and have some of these discussions with your congressmen and senators, and some of your think tanks and universities. So I think there's a lot of work we can do together. It's just a matter of getting on and getting it done.
Absolutely. Senator Van, thank you so much for joining us today. And we hope you will make a stop in Florida when you come to the United States. Thank you, David. Great to see you again. And hopefully we get to talk again soon. Thanks. And thank you for joining us. We'll see you again next week on another episode of Global Perspectives.